And I'm very happy to say that now in this new session, first of all, we are shifting gears. We are now using another really big and important data set, which is the health and retirement study, and actually looking more granular at, who are the people who might actually experiencing financial hardship and what are the risks of financial hardship. And also, then we are going to try to shift and look at this evidence from a more international perspective and actually looking not only at the experience of Japan, but also at the experience of the international group. So let me actually leave the floor now to Karen.
Oops, sorry. Thank you very much, Anna, for that introduction. Thanks to the organizers of the conference. We're really delighted to be here. I'm a huge fan of the PRC's work, and it's an honor to be participating. This is joint work with Jason Brown and Ted Figinski, who were both my colleagues at the Treasury Department. The paper reflects our own views and not the views of any of the organizations that we are affiliated with. What we're doing in this paper is we're exploring what we can say about the likelihood of financial hardship in old age for today's near retirees. And when we were at the Treasury Department, we spent a bunch of time looking at measures of hardship, poor outcomes for people in old age, both because we cared about the human costs of those outcomes, also because as employees of the Treasury Department, we cared about the fiscal implications of that. So we did a lot of that, but if you're thinking about today's near retirees, information about what's going on with people in old age now is going to kind of yield limited information about near retirees, their own likelihood of experiencing hardship in old age because they have different traits than their earlier counterparts. So some of these factors will enhance their economic security. So for example, today's cohort of near retirees, they're going to benefit from having higher female labor force participation rates in their working years. Other factors are going to challenge them relative to earlier cohorts. So obviously having more debt, which is the topic of this conference, will challenge them. They have fewer accumulated assets. Many of them will have longer retirements to finance. So that's the challenge. Our paper builds off the fact that with longitudinal data, you can in fact use information from the earlier cohort to inform you about what's going to happen with today's near retirees. So what we're doing is we tie the observable traits of households nearing retirement in 1994 to actual realizations of economic insecurity in retirement for the same households 20 years later. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to identify what factors drive economic insecurity in later ages. So we're focusing on in people in their late 70s and early 80s, which is when the major risks of things like dementia, widowhood, physical disability, when they manifest. Okay, so that's what we're doing with the first step of our analysis. Okay, and then what we do is we take these linkages that we found, these correlations we found, and we apply them to the current cohort of near retirees with their different traits to project the likelihood that they'll experience economic insecurity in retirement. Okay, so there is obviously a big literature that is working to assess how today's near retirees are going to fare in retirement. Many of those papers have been written by people in this room. To perhaps kind of overly generalize, what many of these papers do is that they're doing some sort of calculation. They're looking at financial information and information about expected future income for near retirees to assess whether they can meet their expected spending needs in retirement. So, this literature includes papers that project replacement rates in retirement. It includes papers that estimate some sort of model, some sort of life cycle model that basically makes predictions about how much saving people need to do, and then they kind of look at people's actual saving to see if they're kind of in line with those predictions. Our paper doesn't do that. We view our paper as a complement to this alternative approach. We are looking at actual realizations of insecurity, which means that we are not only capturing the lack of preparation for expected needs in retirement, we are also capturing the lack of insurance against downside risks. And if you care about hardship, you should care about both those things. A second way in which we are distinct from that other literature is that what we're doing is we're linking this wide set of observable traits to future economic insecurity. We're kind of letting the data speak for itself in this way, and we think that this may pick up a richer set of channels that can drive hardship than papers that use a model or some sort of actuarial calculation. And the third way in which we're distinct is that we are examining a range of specific poor outcomes, some of which have direct connections to future government spending. So we think that has the potential to better focus policymakers who care about those fiscal costs on the risks. Okay, in terms of the nitty-gritty details of what we're doing, just a one slide worth of that. Our estimation sample is the 1932 to 37 birth cohort in the 1994 wave of the Health and Retirement Survey. So these are people who were in late middle age in the mid-1990s. And then what we're doing with this sample is that we're first modeling the probability of surviving until 2014, so surviving for the next 20 years, and then modeling the probability of being economically insecure 20 years later in old age, in the late 70s or early 80s, conditional on surviving. Okay, so that's our estimation. And then what we do with those coefficients is we take them and we basically apply them to the 1952 to 57 birth cohort. So they're nearing retirement in the mid-2000s. We apply them to that cohort to project the incidence of them being economically insecure in 2034, so 20 years later, okay, when they're in old age. In terms of measuring economic insecurity, we have a number of different measures that we look at. So for example, we look at people's income, we look to see if it's below the poverty line, we look at whether they're participating in means-tested programs like Medicaid or food stamps. We are looking at some of the qualitative questions that you find in the HRS. So there's a question, for example, about whether people have enough money to buy the food they need. There's a question about whether they had to cut back meds because they didn't have the financial resources they need. And then we derived a measure of what we're calling annuitized wealth. What that is we're taking people's wealth, their Social Security wealth, their pension wealth, their other wealth, and we're kind of taking the annuity value of that wealth, and then we're adding in any kind of regular stream of income that they have, and then we're looking to see how that compares with the poverty line. We're basically looking to see if that falls below 1.5 times the poverty line, and we're also looking for large drops in that annuitized wealth as a measure of hardship. Okay, so that's our dependent variables. In terms of our independent variables, our right-hand side variables, we have a bunch of measures we're using. Demographics, household composition. Of course, we are taking into account their wealth and in both kind of Social Security and pension accounts, and also their other wealth. We are looking at debt, of course, since that's a topic of our conference. We're looking at their income, and we're also looking at health metrics, various things that are available in the HRS, so including self-reported health, history of smoking, history of illness. So that's the kind of rich set of independent variables that we're using. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go right to our punchline, which is that we find high levels of some types of economic insecurities predicted for households now nearing retirement. And we also find that hardship looks like it'll be considerably more prevalent for today's near retirees than for the 1994 cohort of people in late middle age. So this graph is basically summarizing our results, and what you can see here is the hollow bars are the earlier cohort, that's the people born between 1932 and 1937. The hatched bars are people born 20 years later, 1952 to 1957. And what you can see, you should be looking first at the hatched bars. Those are our various measures of hardship there, but you can see material amounts of people predicted to be in hardship. So you can see kind of 1 in 10 people are on predicted to be on food stamps, similar numbers for cutting back meds and food insecure, 1 in 8 people predicted to be in poverty, 1 in 6 people predicted to be on Medicaid, and then 1 in 4 people predicted to have low levels of annuitized wealth. Okay, so I would call those kind of meaningful levels of hardship. But the other thing you should be noticing in the graph is you can see the outcomes are predicted to be materially worse than for the earlier counterparts. So the hash bars are, for most of the measures, about 50% higher than they are for the earlier cohort. We also looked by gender. Here are our results by gender. So here what we're doing is the 2 different sets of bars. The hollow bar is men, the hatched bars are women. So this is all predicted wealth for today's near retirees. And what you can see is that women are predicted to fare worse than men for most of these measures. So that's still predicted to be true 20 years from now, like it is today, that women are faring worse in old age. We also, I guess, I don't know if you'd call this good news, but we looked at how outcomes were predicted to change. So here what we're doing in these bars is we're looking at kind of the predictions for today's near retirees, but what's the difference from the earlier cohort by, again, men and women for the different sets of bars. And what you can see is that the worsening of outcomes is worst for many of these measures for men than it is for women. And I'll come back to that point in a minute. Digging into what's going on, I guess the first step is to show you some summary statistics. Basically, this is a chart full of kind of medians for key variables in the top panel and a few shares regarding debt in the bottom panel. I know there are many numbers, so let me just highlight a few. So striking differences in other wealth. Okay, so what I mean here is all wealth besides Social Security wealth, so it's including defined benefit, defined contribution, pension plans, and other accumulated wealth. But what you can see, perhaps unsurprisingly, given other findings at this conference and other years, you can see much lower median levels of wealth for kind of the later cohort, today's people who are late middle age. That's for the full sample, that's for men, that's for women as well. Let me just show you the debt numbers in the bottom panel. Actually, the numbers regarding mortgage debt, they're not that different between these 2 cohorts. I suspect what's going on there partly is that if you had looked at kind of the mid-90s, which is when we were sampling the earlier cohort, and you compared it to the period right before the financial crisis, you would have found much higher mortgage numbers for the later cohort, but in fact we're looking at the later cohort in the mid-2010s, so that's a period when kind of mortgage conditions had tightened. So not very big differences there, but you can see with non-mortgage debt, you can see materially high shares of households holding non-mortgage debt. Last thing I want to point out on this table is just kind of women. What you can see here is that actually even though, so you can see that, for example, for their Social Security wealth, you can see that they're the only group for which Social Security wealth looks higher for the later cohort. You can see their earned income is also higher, and that's reflecting what I said earlier about them having higher participation in the labor force, and would be expected to explain why they haven't worsened as much as for men. Okay. So we dug a little deeper and did some counterfactual simulations to try to understand better why the worsening incidence of hardship for the later cohort. So we did several counterfactual simulations, the first of which was looking at debt levels. We looked at whether the 2014 cohort had debt that looked more like the 1994 cohort. Now, so in fact, they had less debt. What we were doing was, by necessity, pretty crude. We were just scaling back people's debt by the ratios, like kind of the averages for the two different cohorts to make the 2014 cohort look more like the 1994 cohort. So we're capturing only the intensive, not the extensive margin there. We looked at whether the 2014 cohort, whether the results would have been different if their demographics had been similar to the 1994 cohort. So in particular, what we saw over these 20 years was we saw a shrinkage of the white non-Hispanic population and growing in growth in the other groups. So what we did was we kind of undid that shrinkage in our counterfactual simulation. And we did a simulation that also looked at whether the 2014 cohort, how they would have fared if they had plans to retire that looked more like the 1994 cohort. So in this case, it would be they expected to retire sooner. 1 minute. Okay, I'm almost there. Thank you, Anna. Here is the results of our counterfactual simulations. The baseline numbers are the hollow bars, and then the bar next to that is the constant debt burden. The bar next to that is the constant demographics. The bar next to that is longer careers. Basically, what you're seeing in this chart is that only the demographic counterfactual made a difference. So, what's going on there, what we think is going on there is that it has to do with the higher wealth of the white non-Hispanic population. We know kind of wealth on average is much higher for that population than the population that was growing over this period. So undoing that made a big difference. Not sure what to say about why undoing the rise in debt didn't make a difference. One thing is it may be just a measurement problem. As I said before, we were only able to capture changes on the intensive margin. But it could be just that if you get to late middle age and you have debt, on average those households actually are better off than other households. The households who are really at the bottom can't get debt at all. So maybe given that we're looking at such poor outcomes, maybe it just doesn't make a difference. Not sure what to say also about kind of why assuming longer working life, or like shortening the working lives doesn't make a difference as well, but I think at face value the results are telling us that we shouldn't count much on the longer working lives of the later cohort to help that cohort. Okay, last slide. Just to summarize our findings, we find a material share of individuals approaching retirement in the mid-2020s are predicted to face one or more types of hardship in old age. If realized, this incidence of hardship will be noticeably higher than the hardship we're seeing for today's people in old age. In terms of next steps, we're still wrestling with the question of why kind of the higher predicted degree of hardship. And that's what we will be doing as we revise the paper. So we would welcome your comments.
Wonderful, thank you.